So welcome to one of our annual webinars. This one's going to cover the financial report of the budget, the MS-535, and the tax rate setting portal. I'm going to keep everybody's lines muted throughout the presentation, just to cut down on background noise. And I sent a message out earlier to the first two attendees, but there is a chat room built into the meeting software. And I'll send out another quick message so everybody can see where it is. So you should see a flashing icon in the software interface. If you click on that, it'll bring up the chat room. And you can use that to send questions to me or ask me to repeat material at any point during the presentation. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the 535 process as a whole. So I'm going to be talking about the tax rate setting process and where this fits into it, as well as the 535 process itself within that, because it's a little unique. It's one of the only processes in the portal where an auditor can participate on the town side of things, and I'll explain how that works. So we'll go over how to get to the interface, how to use the interface, and then the different sections. So it's broken up into tabs, as you'll see in the presentation. Expenditures and revenues, your tax commitment, your long-term debt, the balance sheet, and then finally submitting the whole package to the DRA. So before we get started, I want to know that there are no changes to this process for 2021. So if you did this last year or in 2019, it's exactly the same. The DRA doesn't have any changes pending for this year, so there's no new material to go over. So a quick overview of the tax rate setting process. It started off at the beginning of the year with the drafting of your warrant articles. And those warrant articles become your proposed budget. Most of you are probably already through that step in the process at this point. From that proposed budget, we get your proposed appropriations and your estimated revenues. Those appropriations go to your annual meeting. They become your appropriations as voted, so that's the 2 series. And then later on in the year, you have the ability to revise those estimated revenues on the 4 series. Now, it's these voted appropriations, the revised estimated revenues, and the valuation of your community that figure into the calculation for the tax rate. And the valuation data comes from a separate web portal. You would see it in the tax rate setting portal as the MS1 or the 1V. So those 3 values figure into the process, and from that, the DRA calculates your tax rate. After the end of the year, so whether you're calendar or fiscal, you'll be reporting your actual expenditures, your actual revenues, and some of your long-term debt items back to the DRA on the financial report. So that's the 535. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So a little bit about the typical workflow for the 535. In a lot of cases, a municipal administrator logs in, they enter the MS-535 info, they review the info, they submit it to the DRA, and then it goes through the DRA review process, and then finally it gets approved. What's unique about the 535 is there's an auditor piece, which some of you take advantage of. If you have an auditor, it's a separate phase. The auditor actually enters the 535 information initially, and the auditor submits it to the municipal administrator for review. So it's sort of like an extra submission step. Now, despite the fact that you have an auditor working on this, it's still your job as the municipal administrator to review the 535 information and submit it to the DRA. Now, during this part of the process, you can go back and forth with your auditor. So this is prior to the DRA submission, and you can make changes as needed. So when the auditor submits it to you, you'll get an email. You'll go into the portal and you'll be able to edit any part of the 535. The auditor can edit it at the same time. So you guys can go back and forth and make corrections if needed. Now, again, all of that has to be submitted to the DRA afterwards. And during the DRA review, if they find an issue, they can flag your 535 for resubmission. In that case, you would get an email if it was rejected here, and the 535 gets unlocked and returned to you so that you can go back through that corrections and revisions process and then resubmit it. It's relatively painless. Resubmissions happen all the time, so no need to panic. Usually it's an account code that was missed or something minor. And then the resubmission process was identical to the first time that you submitted it. It's the same submit button, the same checks, and everything else. So accessing the 535 review interface, you can get to this interface from either the Financial tab or by clicking the Continue button next to your Financial home. So this is right when you log in. They both go to the same place. And then on this interface, so this is the Financial tab, you'll click Continue next to 535 Review. This is going to bring you to the 535 interface itself. And it's broken into a couple different sections. And we'll go over all of them today. So you're going to start off on the Home tab. You'll have other tabs across the top, Expenditures and Revenues, the Tax Commitment tab, Long-Term Debt, and the Balance Sheet. Right below that, we can see the status of our 535. In this case, we haven't completed our municipal review. We haven't submitted it to the DRA. Right below that, there's a question about emergency expenditures or any expenditures involved with non-lapsing appropriations, anything unanticipated. If you received anything and you mark this as yes, you have to provide an explanation below. And if you miss the explanation, it won't let you submit. And if the explanation isn't detailed enough, the DRA will probably flag it for resubmission and you'll have to go in and revise it. Over on the right is the entity contact information. In this case, for this example, I have an auditor. So I've put in, or they've put in their own name, but as the administrator, I can edit that information. And then the preparer, which is the person who ultimately submits everything, enters their name, phone, and email below that. So basically, this is a way for the DRA to not only see who clicked the submit button, because we can see that in our audit logs, but also to get in touch with the preparer, if it was a separate user, and the auditor. Right below that, we have a series of buttons, and you're going to see these buttons, except for the submit button, on the other tabs. It's important to note that the submit button is only on this home tab. So if you finish the process and you're on the balance sheet tab, you're not going to see the submit button. And they all do pretty much what you'd expect. Save in home saves your progress and brings you back to the financial tab. Save and recalculate keeps you in this interface, but saves your work. The blue MS-535 report button is what will let you run your draft report and then ultimately your final report after you've submitted. And then that submit for DRA review is pretty self-evident. If you were an auditor, so if you did not have an administrative account, you have a button there with different text on it. I believe it says complete auditor preparation. If you click that button as an auditor, an email gets sent to the municipal administrator and prompts them to log in and review the work. So that's the auditor piece that I talked about. So we'll take a look at the second tab, Expenditures and Revenues. So this is the same account codes table that you've seen throughout the portal. It's divided into two sub-tabs, Expenditures and Revenues. And each of these tabs has a breakdown on the left. These are the account code categories. And then the accounts within each category are what are in the table to the right. This particular interface has three columns. The first is your appropriated column. So this is the amount that came out of your voted appropriations last year. This is not editable. You don't need to worry about it. We have the expended column, which is where you're actually reporting last year's numbers. So this is the column that you'll be editing. And then there's an explanation column. This is where you could put notes for your advisor if there was anything unusual about last year. And if you have an unanticipated expenditure or revenue where the original appropriated or estimated amount was 0, meaning you had no idea you were going to use that account code, but you ended up having money going into or coming from that account code, you'll have to provide an explanation in order to submit. Down to the bottom, we've got 3 rows. The top one is the only one you can edit. This is where you would enter any expended amounts from special revenue or capital projects funds. And then below that, we can see the total commitment for other governments, and then the resulting total general fund expenditures. Now the revenues interface, the revenues tab here, is the same table with the same functionality and the same rows at the bottom. So it's all the same process, whether you're reporting your actual expenditures or your actual revenues. So let's jump over to the next tab. The next tab was added a couple years ago. This is the tax commitment tab. This is a read-only tab. It's just for information purposes. There's nothing that you need to edit or change here. This gives you a breakdown of your numbers on this MS-535 submission. That's that top row. The commitment amounts, and then the difference between them. So the commitment amounts come from other submissions and other pieces of the tax rate setting process, and this is just sort of your way to check your math. Again, this tab is for reference purposes. There's nothing here that you need to worry about. It was just a commonly requested feature. So long-term debt. This is the 4th tab. At the top of this interface, we have a summary of all of our outstanding debt or new debt that we've issued during the year, anything we've retired, and then below that we have our actual debt schedule. So these are the individual items, bonds, things of that nature. And there are a few things you can do on this interface. You can go through and revise the data as needed. All these fields are editable. If needed, you can go in and you can delete things. So let's say you had something that was completely paid off. You can delete that from the debt schedule here just by clicking the red icon. And if you had anything new that was issued during the year, you click the green Add Line button, and it will give you a blank line at the bottom. So it pretty much does all of the end of year math for you that you see all the way over on the right. So all you're responsible for are the details. Okay, so the balance sheet tab. This is probably where you'll end up spending a lot of time. Again, this has some sub-tabs and a couple different sections. These tabs across the top are for your balance sheet assets, liabilities, and fund equity. And then the contents of each tab are in the table below them. So you'll see that we've got account codes here and some other columns. Below that, we have our beginning of year and our end of year totals for fund equity and liability. Now, this section here, where you have those totals up at the top and these 2 panels below, this is always visible no matter what tab of the balance sheet you're on. So these 2 panels contain your general fund balance sheet reconciliation and then your school reconciliation. And I'll talk about both of these a little bit more. So we're going to take a quick look at the rest of this first. So we're starting off on the assets section of our balance sheet. We have our current year, beginning of year numbers already. So these were your end of year numbers for the last filing period, and they kind of get rolled over into this. If you need to, you can make corrections. We know that things happen throughout the year that may not have been reported in the portal. So you can come in and you can change these numbers. Right next to them, this is our end of year column. So this is basically going to give the DRA the situation at the beginning of the year, the situation at the end of the year, so they can see the change in our assets. And then finally, an explanation field. Just like with expenditures and revenues, if anything unusual happened throughout the year or you feel the need to explain something to your advisor, This is where you would put the notes for it. So jumping over to the Liabilities tab, we have the same 3 columns, our beginning of year balances, our end of year balances, and the explanation. But the one unique thing about this tab is we have this line here. This is account code 2075. This comes from your school district reconciliation piece. So that's that panel at the bottom of the interface that we saw. All you need to do here is provide it with the beginning of year liability balance and then any payments that you made. And it's going to automatically calculate your end of year. So again, if you come to this interface and you're trying to edit that and those fields are disabled, it's on the school reconciliation worksheet where you can change that number. So the final balance sheet tab is fund equity. It's the same functionality as assets and liabilities. We've got the same 3 tabs again. So the whole interface, everything's pretty similar in terms of function. So let's talk about that general fund balance sheet reconciliation over here on the left. All of these numbers are calculated from all of the other information that you enter. It's going to calculate the change, or rather the difference between your revenues and expenditures, as well as the change in your fund equities. And if those 2 numbers aren't the same, that is, if the difference between your revenues and expenditures isn't equal to the change in your fund equity, it means something is off. You've missed a number or something's been misreported. And the system will not let you submit the 535 until those 2 numbers are identical. So every dollar gets accounted for. If you try and submit, it's going to give you a warning. If you correctly tie everything out, that red warning at the bottom here will turn green, and it'll basically tell you that you're all set. That was the first check. The second check is the end of year totals from your assets tab, or rather at the bottom of it. What it's going to do is the system's going to compare your end of year assets to your end of year fund equity plus liabilities. So those 2 numbers should be equal as well. And if you go in and you try and submit and it catches an error there, it will tell you that those are out of balance. So these are sort of just math checks. They're pretty simple, just to try and make sure you haven't missed anything. Finally, if everything's all set, you're happy with everything, your auditor is happy if you have one, this is where you would click Submit for DRA review. So that's pretty much the end of the MS-535 process. I will mention that if you get stuck or you have questions related to, let's say, account codes or how to report an expenditure or anything like that, reach out to your municipal advisor, and you can find their contact information right when you log into the portal. It's in a yellow box up at the top right corner. If you run into an error in the portal or you're not sure how to do something, just reach out to our technical support team or use the help link at the top right corner. That'll bring you to our support portal, which has step-by-step guidance and short videos that cover everything I talked about today. It covers all aspects of the tax rate setting process. And you can also send us a ticket from there. So whether you send a ticket from the support portal or you send us an email, it all goes to the same people.